Stay with me! Save me! No, please wake up! I can't lose you!
The impact lasted barely 3 seconds. 3 seconds that shattered the rhythmic, safe hum of a luxury engine, silenced the city's heartbeat, and turned a rainy night into a tragedy that could never be undone. Lee Hyun-soo felt the shift immediately, the sudden, violent transformation of the air and the way the space on the wet pavement tightened, as if the flickering streetlights had leaned in to witness his fall. He was on his knees before the sirens even started screaming. He was a man of concrete and numbness, a broad-shouldered monolith of iron who had built an empire on the absence of emotion. Yet here he was, rain-soaked and shattered. The pristine white of his dress shirt was already stained with a map of crimson as he reached into the wreckage. He pulled her from the twisted metal, a vibrant ghost in a red evening gown that looked like a bloodstain against the gray gloom. As he cradled her, his tailored suit drenched and his composed mask fracturing, the powerful boss disappeared. In his place was a man brought to his knees, staring into the fading eyes of a woman whose urgent, dying grip on his collar held a silent promise. Her final words would be the fire that burned his world to the ground. The sky over the city didn't just rain. It mourned in a relentless, gray deluge that turned the asphalt into a mirror of neon and oil. Inside the rear of the black sedan, Lee Hyun-soo sat enveloped in the rhythmic, safe hum of a luxury engine, a sound that usually signaled his absolute control over the world outside the glass. He was a man of concrete and numbness, his mind already drifting toward the cold logistics of the Russo-Korean merger, oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed fortress of a life was about to be breached. The impact lasted barely 3 seconds. 3 seconds that shattered the silence, shredded the heavy air, and turned a routine transit into an irreversible tragedy. There was no warning, only the sudden, violent scream of tires against slick pavement and the visceral, bone-jarring crunch of metal meeting metal. The world tilted, the reinforced frame of the sedan groaning under a force it was never meant to endure. As the vehicle spun to a halt amidst a rain of diamond dust glass, the silence that followed was more deafening than the crash itself. Hyun-soo pushed against the deploying airbags, his lungs burning with the scent of ozone and smoke. Through the spider-webbed windshield, he saw it, a streak of vibrant, impossible crimson against the gray gloom. A red evening gown, draped like a bloodstain over the wreckage of a car that had appeared from the shadows like a ghost. He didn't wait for his security detail. He threw himself into the torrential downpour, his tailored luxury suit soaking through instantly, his composure falling away with every desperate stride. He reached the woman just as the first flicker of blue and red emergency lights began to pulse in the distance. He fell to his knees on the wet pavement, a monolith of iron brought low by a sight he couldn't process. Kim Era lay reclined across the street, her delicate features illuminated by the flickering streetlights, appearing fragile yet anchored by a terrifying urgency. As Hyun-soo leaned protectively over her, supporting her head with a hand that had commanded empires but now trembled like a leaf, he felt his man of stone persona fracture. Her pale skin was cold, mixing with the rainwater and a single, trailing tear on her cheek. When her hand weakly reached up to clutch his white dress shirt, staining the silk with streaks of red, the air around them seemed to tighten. Hyun-soo's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with a shock and desperation that his subordinates had never seen. In that moment, the powerful boss was gone, replaced by a man staring into the fading eyes of a mystery that had just destroyed his world. "Stay with me," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper lost in the rain. But as Era's lips parted to deliver the words that would unearth his buried past, Hyun-soo realized the crash wasn't an accident, it was a summons. The impact had ended, but the shattering of Lee Hyun-soo had only just begun. The rain intensified, a cold curtain that seemed to isolate the wreckage from the rest of the world. Lee Hyun-soo remained motionless on the pavement, his broad frame shielding Kim Era from the relentless downpour. His silhouetted bodyguards stood like rigid statues in the distance, their forms backlit by the rhythmic, strobe-like flash of red and blue emergency lights. For the first time in their years of service, they witnessed a crack in the monolith. Their boss, a man who had presided over the harshest winters of the underworld without flinching, was now a portrait of raw, human devastation. Beneath the roar of the storm, the air between Hyun-soo and Era grew heavy and static. Her grip on his blood-streaked white shirt tightened with a sudden, desperate strength, pulling him closer until his ear was inches from her lips. The world around them, the sirens, the shouting, the empire he had built, simply ceased to exist. "He lied to you," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to snap with every breath. "The one you trust, the one who stood behind you at the funeral, he was the one who pulled the trigger." A single, hot tear escaped Hyun-soo's eye, mixing with the frigid rainwater on his cheek. It was a breach in his fortress, a moment that could never be taken back. He felt the weight of her words like a physical blow, turning his internal world of concrete and blood into a wasteland of doubt. For 20 years, he had filled the hole in his heart with iron, believing he had outrun the ghosts of his past. Now, those ghosts had caught up to him in a red evening gown. "Who?" Hyun-soo breathed, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that sent a ripple of unease through the men watching from the shadows. "Era, tell me who." Her eyes, once sharp and piercing, began to lose their focus, searching his face one last time with a look of profound, tragic recognition. "The dragon has a parasite," she managed, her breath hitching. "Look at the hands. Look at the gold." Her fingers suddenly went limp, sliding down his chest and leaving a trail of crimson against the white silk. Her head fell back, her long, dark hair cascading across the wet pavement like a shroud. The silence following her final breath was more violent than the crash itself. Hyun-soo didn't move. He sat there, a sharp-suited monolith of iron and secrets, now shattered by a truth he wasn't prepared to handle. The bodyguards remained frozen, stunned by the sight of their leader kneeling in the mud, cradling a ghost. The man of stone had finally been broken, and as the sirens closed in, it was clear that the Order of Tears had begun. The Empire wasn't just cracking, it was preparing to shatter, and Kim Era's final words were the fault line. The transition from the blood-slicked asphalt to the sterile, blinding whiteness of the hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic squeak of gurneys. Lee Hyun-soo stood in the center of the private surgical wing, a dark, rain-soaked stain against the pristine environment. He hadn't washed the blood from his hands. It had dried into a dark, tacky reminder of the life that had just slipped through his fingers. His bodyguards stood at the end of the hallway, their presence a silent, looming threat that kept the hospital staff at a distance. But inside the cold white room, Hyun-soo felt smaller than he ever had in his life. Dr. Yoo Min-suk stepped out from behind the heavy swinging doors, his face a mask of clinical weariness. He didn't offer a bow or a platitude. He knew the man standing before him wasn't interested in the formalities of the living. Instead, the doctor held out a small, stainless steel tray. On it lay a single item, cleaned of the night's tragedy, but carrying a weight far heavier than its physical form. "We found this tucked into the lining of her dress," Dr. Yoo said, his voice echoing softly against the tiled walls. It wasn't a weapon. It was a message. Hyun-soo's breath hitched as he looked down at the object. It was a tarnished silver locket, the metal dented and the chain snapped, but the engraving on the front was unmistakable, a small, intricately carved dragon entwined around a lily. His heart, which he had spent decades turning into a block of ice, suffered a sudden, violent crack. With trembling fingers, he picked up the piece of jewelry. It was cold, yet it burned his palm. He clicked the latch open. Inside was a faded, water-damaged photograph of two children standing in front of a cherry blossom tree, a young boy with a protective arm around a smaller girl. It was a relic from a life he had buried beneath layers of concrete and blood, a piece of a childhood he had been told was burned to the ground 20 years ago. She wasn't just a stranger, Hyun-soo whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of the crash itself. The locket was the twin to the one he kept locked in a floor safe at his estate, the only thing he had left of the sister he thought he had failed to save during the great purge of the syndicates. The final words Era had gasped in the rain began to coalesce into a terrifying clarity. If she had this, then his entire history was a lie constructed by the very men who now stood outside the door, guarding his life while plotting his end. The clinical silence of the room grew suffocating. Hyun-soo looked at Dr. Yu, his eyes no longer filled with the cold authority of a boss, but the raw, jagged desperation of a man who had just discovered he had been living in a house of mirrors. The dragon did indeed have a parasite, and as he clutched the locket, Hyun-soo realized that the war for his empire was nothing compared to the war for the truth of his own blood. Outside the surgical wing, the atmosphere had shifted from protective vigilance to a predatory stillness. Jang Tae-shik, the chief enforcer, stood by the panoramic window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the lashing rain. He did not look like a man grieving the near loss of his leader. He looked like a wolf scenting a change in the wind. His hands, encased in soft leather gloves, were clasped behind his back, rigid, disciplined, and entirely devoid of the tremor that had seized Hyun-soo. As the other lieutenants paced the hallway, their faces etched with uncertainty, Tae-shik beckoned them into the dim alcove of the waiting area. He moved with a calculated grace, his presence filling the vacuum left by Hyun-soo's absence. When he spoke, his voice was a low, melodic rasp, devoid of the jagged edge of the storm outside. "Look at him," Tae-shik whispered, his eyes casting toward the closed door of the white room where the boss remained huddled over a tarnished locket. The dragon we followed was a creature of iron. He was the winter that never broke. But tonight, on that pavement, I didn't see a king. I saw a man who bleeds for a ghost. The lieutenants exchanged uneasy glances, the seed of doubt beginning to take root. In their world, emotion was a contagion, a terminal weakness that invited the vultures. Tae-shik leaned in closer, his shadow stretching long across the sterile floor. A leader who can be brought to his knees by a woman's whisper is a leader who has already surrendered. Kwon Dae-sik is already moving his pieces in the dark. If we wait for Hyun-soo to find his soul, we will all lose our heads. He paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of his treason. He wasn't just suggesting a change in command. He was declaring the bankruptcy of the old regime. The dragon is wounded, he continued, his gaze locking onto each man with a terrifying, cold focus. And a wounded predator is nothing more than a liability to the pack. It is time we stop guarding a man who has forgotten how to rule and start protecting the empire he is too broken to hold. One by one, the rigid postures of the guards began to turn toward Tae-shik. The loyalty that had once been a monolithic wall was now a series of cracks, widening under the pressure of his words. Tae-shik's lips curled into the ghost of a smile as he adjusted his cufflink, a small, golden dragon. He didn't need to draw a weapon. The machine was already resetting itself. While Hyun-soo searched for the truth of his blood, his family was preparing the executioner's shroud, and the scent of betrayal was now thicker than the smell of antiseptic in the air. The heavy surgical doors swung shut behind Lee Hyun-soo, the click of the latch sounding like a hammer falling on a hollow chamber. He stood in the corridor, the silver locket clutched so tightly in his palm that the metal bit into his skin. He looked down the long, white throat of the hallway. At the far end, Jang Tae-shik stood surrounded by the lieutenants, their huddle breaking apart like a school of sharks at the sight of him. The air was no longer thick with the scent of antiseptic. It was heavy with the metallic tang of an impending betrayal. Tae-shik didn't bow. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply adjusted his gold dragon cufflink and gave a nod that felt more like a signal than a greeting. Before the enforcer could speak, a firm hand gripped Hyun-soo's elbow. It wasn't the aggressive grasp of a captor, but the urgent, grounding touch of a man who had seen the cliff's edge before the car reached it. "Oh Sang-woo," Hyunsu's personal driver stood beside him, his cap pulled low and his eyes darting toward the side exit. "The car is idling at the service ramp, boss," Sang-woo murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the hum of the hospital's ventilation. "The main entrance is cleared, Sang-woo," Tae-shik interrupted, his voice smooth and dangerous. "The boss needs the armored convoy for the trip back to the estate. It's safer." Sang-woo didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the enforcer. He kept his gaze locked on Hyunsu, his expression an open book of a loyalty that had been forged in the quiet hours of 1,000 drives, not in the bloody spectacles of the syndicate. "The service ramp, sir," he repeated. "The rain is too heavy for the convoy. We take the narrow routes." Hyunsu saw the flicker of irritation in Tae-shik's eyes, a predator whose trap had just been bypassed by a man he considered invisible. In that moment, Hyunsu chose the ghost over the machine. He followed Sang-woo. They moved through the labyrinthine back halls of the hospital, passing janitorial carts and laundry bins. As they reached the service ramp, the roar of the storm rushed in to meet them. A nondescript, mud-splattered SUV sat waiting, its engine purring with a hidden, high-performance heart. "They swapped the lead car in the convoy, sir," Sang-woo said as he threw the vehicle into gear, the tires screaming as they cleared the ramp just seconds before Tae-shik's men appeared in the rearview mirror. "It wasn't meant to reach the estate. They were going to lose you in the tunnel." Hyunsu looked at the man behind the wheel, a man he had never truly thanked, a man he had ruled through routine rather than terror. "Why?" Hyunsu asked, his voice raw. "Tae-shik would have made you a captain for delivering me." Sang-woo navigated a sharp turn, his hands steady on the wheel. "My father lived for 70 years because he knew the difference between a king who is feared and a man who is loved. You gave my daughter the best doctors when she was sick, sir. You didn't do it for power. You did it because you remembered what it was like to lose someone." As they disappeared into the gray curtain of the rain, leaving the dragon's palace behind, Hyunsu realized that while his empire was built on iron, his survival now rested on the only thing Tae-shik could never understand, a loyalty that couldn't be bought, only earned. The SUV cut through the darkness of a coastal backroad, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers the only sound in the cabin. Lee Hyunsu sat in the passenger seat, the silver locket open in his palm. The faded photograph of the two children seemed to pulse under the rhythmic flash of passing street lamps. With Oh Sang-woo's help, they had detoured to a secluded safe house, a place forgotten by the syndicate, a place where ghosts could finally speak. Inside the dusty cottage, Sang-woo handed Hyunsu a thin, weather-beaten file he had retrieved from a hidden compartment in the car's trunk. As Hyunsu turned the pages, the man of stone felt his breath hitch. The woman in the red dress wasn't just a messenger. She was a miracle he had been taught to forget. Kim Era was born Lee Era. She was the little girl from the photograph, the sister he believed had perished in the warehouse fire 20 years ago, the fire Jang Tae-shik claimed to have rescued him from. But the records told a different story. Era hadn't died. She had been taken. She had been raised in the shadows of a rival faction, a pawn kept in reserve by those who knew the truth of Hyunsu's bloodline. She had spent 2 decades watching her brother become the monster he was today, ruled by the very man who had orchestrated their family's destruction. The realization was a jagged blade in his heart. She hadn't crashed into him to kill him. She had crashed into him because it was the only way to get close enough to bypass the machine. She knew Tae-shik's surveillance was absolute, that every phone call was recorded and every meeting monitored. To save her brother from the parasite, she had to orchestrate a tragedy so profound that it would force him to stop and look, really look, at the world around him. She had been terminal, the medical reports in the file revealed. A quiet, aggressive illness had been stealing her life months before the crash. Knowing her time was short, she had chosen to turn her death into a final, sacrificial strike against the betrayal that had defined their lives. She chose the red dress to stand out against the gray lies of the city. She chose the impact to break the iron shell Hyunsu had grown around his soul. Hyunsu closed the file, his eyes burning with a grief that went deeper than bone. He looked out at the rain, finally understanding the order of tears. Era hadn't just died in his arms. She had returned home to wake him up. She had traded her final breaths for his awakening, leaving him with a truth that burned brighter than any empire. The sister he had mourned for 20 years had saved him twice, once by living in the shadows, and once by dying in the light. The safe house was a sanctuary of dust and truth, but the peace was short-lived. A sudden, sharp vibration on the wooden table cut through the silence. Oh Sang-woo's phone lit up with a frantic message from Dr. Yumin Suk. They're here. Not our men. It's a massacre. Hyun-soo's blood turned to ice. Kwon Dae-sik, the rival leader who had waited like a vulture in the periphery, had seen the crack in the dragon's armor. He wasn't waiting for the civil war between Hyun-soo and Tae-shik to finish. He had launched a full-scale siege on the hospital to erase the witnesses of Era's final moments and finish the wounded king. We have to go back, Hyun-soo commanded, his voice regaining that terrifying, low resonance. The drive back was a blur of high-speed maneuvers through the flooded streets. By the time the SUV skidded to a halt near the hospital's rear entrance, the building was a fortress under siege. The rhythmic flash of police lights had been replaced by the jagged, orange bloom of muzzle flashes from the upper floors. Hyun-soo moved with a predatory grace, the silver locket tucked securely over his heart. He wasn't fighting for his empire anymore. He was fighting for the man who held the evidence of Era's life. They entered through the same service ramp they had escaped from, but the air was now thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Kwon's mercenaries had cut the power. In a strobe-like flickering of the emergency generators, the hallways had become a killing floor. Hyun-soo moved like a shadow, his movements precise and lethal. He bypassed the main lobbies where the noise was loudest, navigating the service corridors he had learned by instinct. He found Dr. Yu huddled in the cold storage unit of the morgue, clutching a digital drive containing the high-resolution scans of Era's internal messages, scans that Tae-shik had ordered destroyed. "You're still here," the doctor whispered, his surgical mask splattered with red. "I'm not leaving anyone else behind," Hyun-soo replied. Just as they turned to exit, the heavy steel door was kicked open. The mercenaries poured in, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness. Hyun-soo stood tall, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the freezing mist of the morgue. He was a man who had lost his crown of iron, but as he drew his weapon to protect the living, it was clear he had found something far more dangerous, a reason to live. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was the anvil upon which Lee Hyun-soo was being forged into something the underworld had never seen. The smoke from the hospital's siege still clung to Hyun-soo's coat as he stepped into the penthouse of his estate. The silence here was a different kind of violence, not the roar of gunfire, but the suffocating stillness of a tomb. Jang Tae-shik was waiting for him, seated behind the massive mahogany desk that had always belonged to the boss. He was swirling a glass of amber liquid, the golden dragon on his cufflink catching the dim light of the fireplace like the eye of a snake. "You're late for your own funeral, Hyun-soo," Tae-shik said, his voice devoid of its usual rehearsed deference. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. The lieutenants were gone, the hallways filled with men whose loyalties had shifted toward the person holding the purse strings. Hyun-soo walked toward him, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't pull his weapon. Instead, he reached into his pocket and tossed the silver locket onto the desk. It landed with a hollow metallic click that seemed to echo through the entire room. Tae-shik's gaze flickered to the jewelry, and for a fraction of a second, the mask of the predator slipped, revealing the rot beneath. "You knew," Hyun-soo said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "For 20 years, you told me I was alone. You told me the fire took everyone, so that you could step into the ashes and call yourself my brother. But you weren't the savior, Tae-shik. You were the match." Tae-shik let out a short, dry laugh, setting his glass down. "I gave you a kingdom, Hyun-soo. I carved a god out of a traumatized boy. If I hadn't hidden the girl, you would have spent your life looking back instead of looking forward. You wouldn't have had the stomach for what this life requires. What this life requires, Hyun-soo repeated, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. You didn't hide her for my sake. You kept her as a contingency. You let her die to protect the lie that kept me on your leash. Tae-shik stood up then, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. He leaned in, the gold dragon on his wrist gleaming. The dragon is a myth, Hyun-soo. The only thing real in this world is the iron. And you've grown soft. You've traded your crown for a handful of tears. Hyun-soo looked at the man he had trusted with his life, seeing finally the parasite that had been draining his soul. The chief enforcer wasn't a brother or a friend. He was the architect of every tragedy Hyun-soo had ever endured. The price of the crown had been his family's blood, and as Hyun-soo reached out to reclaim the locket, the air in the room grew static. The betrayal was complete, the lines were drawn, and for the first time in his life, Lee Hyun-soo wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for the justice the machine had tried to burn away. The shadows in the penthouse elongated as the fire died down to a smoldering amber, casting Jang Tae-shik's silhouette in jagged, monstrous proportions. The chief enforcer didn't wait for a formal declaration of war. He moved with the lethal, practiced speed of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of the kill. He drew a sleek, blackened pistol from his shoulder holster, his thumb clicking the safety off with a sound like a bone snapping in the silence. But Lee Hyun-soo didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his own weapon. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Tae-shik's hands, the very hands that Era had warned him to watch with her final, ragged breath. He saw the subtle tension in the enforcer's forearms and the way his weight shifted toward his left heel. In that moment of absolute clarity, Hyun-soo didn't see a superior tactician. He saw a man blinded by his own arrogance. Tae-shik's finger tightened on the trigger, but Hyun-soo moved a fraction of a second earlier. He didn't retreat. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the trajectory of the barrel could settle. The first shot roared through the room, the bullet grazing Hyun-soo's shoulder and tearing through the fine silk of his white dress shirt, leaving a searing trail of crimson across his chest. Hyun-soo ignored the pain. He used the momentum to drive his palm into Tae-shik's wrist, the silver locket still clutched in his other hand like a talisman. He remembered the red Era had provided, the gold dragon cufflink. As they grappled, Hyun-soo twisted the enforcer's arm, using the very symbol of Tae-shik's stolen status as a lever. With a sickening crack, the cufflink dug into Tae-shik's flesh, and the pistol clattered to the floor. You said the iron was the only thing real, Hyun-soo hissed, his voice a low, terrifying vibration against Tae-shik's ear as he pinned him against the mahogany desk. But iron is brittle. It breaks under pressure. Truth is what endures. Tae-shik thrashed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, desperate rage, but Hyun-soo's grip was a vice forged in 20 years of suppressed grief. Outside the door, the sound of the rival syndicate's remnants clashing with Sang-woo's loyalist few echoed through the halls, but inside this circle of light, the world had narrowed to 2 men and a lifetime of lies. Hyun-soo looked down at the blood staining his white shirt, a map of his sister's sacrifice and his own rebirth. He didn't deliver a killing blow with a blade or a bullet. Instead, he forced Tae-shik to look at the locket, at the photograph of the children he had tried to erase. The enforcer's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror finally breaking through his cold exterior. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a power struggle. He had lost the machine itself. Hyun-soo shoved the traitor away, letting him fall into the darkness beyond the desk. The dragon was no longer wounded. He was finally, dangerously awake. The heavy mahogany doors of the estate stood open, letting in the scent of damp earth and the first fragile light of a new dawn. Inside, the machine lay in ruins. The gold dragon cufflinks and the ledgers of blood money sat untouched on the desk, relics of a kingdom that Lee Hyun-soo no longer recognized as his own. He stood in the center of the foyer, his white shirt stained with a map of the night's violence. But his eyes were clear, reflecting a peace that no amount of power had ever been able to buy. Jang Tae-shik was gone, turned over to the authorities along with the evidence of 2 decades of systemic betrayal, a final, clinical extraction of the parasite. The syndicate lieutenants, those who had survived the night's transition, waited in the driveway, their engines idling, expecting a new set of orders, a new target, or a new reign of fear. Hyun-soo stepped out onto the portico. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally put down a crushing weight. Oh Sang-woo stood by the lead SUV, his posture no longer rigid with the expectation of a strike, but relaxed, a silent partner in this final act. "The men are waiting for the word, sir," Sang-woo said softly. Hyun-soo looked out over the sprawling estate, then at the silver locket he held in his palm. He thought of Era in her red dress, a vibrant splash of truth against a gray world. She hadn't died so he could be a better king. She had died so he could be a man again. "Tell them the dragon is dead," Hyun-soo replied, his voice steady and warm, devoid of the cold resonance that had once paralyzed rooms. "The empire is dissolved. The assets are to be liquidated into the foundation for the victims of the purge. There are no more orders. They are free." A ripple of shock went through the assembled guards, but Hyun-soo didn't stay to watch the aftermath. He walked toward Sang-woo's personal, nondescript car, not the armored fortress, but the vehicle of a friend. As they drove away from the iron gates, Hyun-soo watched the estate shrink in the rearview mirror. He wasn't retreating, he was arriving. He directed Sang-woo to the quiet cemetery where the cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom, mirroring the faded photograph in his pocket. He knelt by a fresh, modest marker and placed the silver locket on the stone. The Order of Tears had reached its final line. He had traded his crown of thorns for a life of honesty, leaving the concrete and blood behind to find the home Era had built for him with her final breath. As the sun rose, casting a golden glow over the city he once ruled, Lee Hyun-soo finally walked into the light, a man of gold, home at last.